for one final time, putting your alien/God hat on, and you look at human civilization, do you think about the 7.8 billion people on Earth as individual little creatures, individual little organisms, or do you think of us as one organism with a collective intelligence? What's the proper framework through which to analyze it, again, as an alien?
So that I know where you're coming from, would you have asked the question the same way before the Industrial Revolution, or before the Agricultural Revolution, when there were 500 million people and no telecommunications connecting them?
I would indeed ask the question the same way, but I would be less confident about your conclusions. It would be an actually more interesting way to ask the question at that time, but I was nevertheless asked it the same way. Yes.
Well, let's go back further and smaller then. Rather than just a single human or the entire human species, let's look at a relatively isolated tribe.
Yes.
In the relatively isolated, probably sub-Dunbar number, sub kind of 150 people tribe, do I look at that as one entity where evolution is selecting for it based on group selection, or do I think of it as 150 individuals that are interacting in some way? Well, could those individuals exist without the group? No. The evolutionary adaptiveness of humans was involved critically group selection, and individual humans alone trying to figure out stone tools and protection and whatever aren't what was selected for. And so I think the or is the wrong frame. I think it's individuals are affecting the group that they're a part of. They're also dependent upon and being affected by the group that they're part of. And so this now starts to get in deep into political theories also, which is theories that orient towards the collective at different scales, whether a tribal scale or an empire or a nation state or something, and ones that orient towards the individual, liberalism and stuff like that. And I think there's very obvious failure modes on both sides. And so the relationship between them is more interesting to me than either of them. The relationship between the individual and the collective, and the question around how to have a virtuous process between those. So a good social system would be one where the organism of the individual and the organism of the group of individuals they're both synergistic to each other. So what is best for the individuals and what's best for the whole is aligned.
But there is nevertheless an individual. They're not, it's a matter of degrees, I suppose, but what defines a human more? The social network within which they've been brought up, through which they've developed their intelligence, or is it their own sovereign individual self? Like, what's your intuition of how much, not just for evolutionary survival, but as intellectual beings, how much do we need others for our development?
Yeah. I think we have a weird sense of this today relative to most previous periods of sapient history. I think the vast majority of sapient history is tribal, like depending upon your early human model, 200,000 or 300,000 years of Homo sapiens in little tribes, where they depended upon that tribe for survival, and excommunication from the tribe was fatal. I think and our whole evolutionary genetic history is in that environment, and the amount of time we've been out of it is relatively so tiny. And then we still depended upon extended families and local communities more. And the big kind of giant market complex where I can provide something to the market to get money, to be able to get other things from the market, where it seems like I don't need anyone. It's almost like disintermediating our sense of need, even though your and my ability to talk to each other using these mics and the phones that we coordinated on took millions of people over 6 continents to be able to run the supply chains that made all the stuff that we depend on, but we don't notice that we depend upon them. They all seem fungible. If you take a baby, obviously that you didn't even get to a baby without a mom. Was it dependent? Are we dependent upon each other, right? Without two parents at minimum, and they depended upon other people. But if we take that baby and we put it out in the wild, it obviously dies. So if we let it grow up for a little while, the minimum amount of time where it starts to have some autonomy, and then we put it out in the wild, and this has happened a few times, it doesn't learn language. And it doesn't learn the small motor articulation that we learn. It doesn't learn the type of consciousness that we end up having that is socialized. So I think we take for granted how much conditioning affects us.
Is it possible that it affects basically 99.9 or maybe the whole thing? The whole thing is the connection between us humans, and that we're no better than apes without our human connections. Because that thinking of it that way forces us to think very differently about human society and how to progress forward, if the connections are fundamental.
I just have to object to the no better than apes, because better here, I think you mean a specific thing, which means have capacities that are fundamentally different than. I think apes also depend upon troops.
Yes.
And I think the idea of humans as better than nature in some kind of ethical sense ends up having heaps of problems. We'll table that. We can come back to it. But when we say what is unique about Homo sapien capacity relative to the other animals we currently inhabit the biosphere with, and I'm saying it that way because there were other early hominids that had some of these capacities, we believe. Our tool creation and our language creation and our coordination are all kind of the results of a certain type of capacity for abstraction. And other animals will use tools, but they don't evolve the tools they use. They keep using the same types of tools that they basically can find. So a chimp will notice that a rock can cut a vine that it wants to, and it'll even notice that a sharper rock will cut it better, and experientially it'll use the sharper rock. And if you even give it a knife, it'll probably use the knife because it's experiencing the effectiveness. But it doesn't make stone tools, because that requires understanding why one is sharper than the other. What is the abstract principle called sharpness, to then be able to invent a sharper thing? That same abstraction makes language and the ability for abstract representation, which makes the ability to coordinate in a more advanced set of ways. So I do think our ability to coordinate with each other is pretty fundamental to the selection of what we are as a species.
I wonder if that coordination, that connection, is actually the thing that gives birth to consciousness, that gives birth to, well, let's start with self-awareness.
It's more like theory of mind.
Theory of mind, yeah. I mean, I suppose there's experiments that show that there's other mammals that have a very crude theory of mind. I'm not sure, maybe dogs, something like that. But actually, dogs probably has to do with that they co-evolved with humans